Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
Old Man's Beard by H. Russell Wakefield. Mr. Bickley almost precisely satisfies our American friend's definition of a regular fella. That is to say, he makes an article of commerce and by selling it at 7 times its cost of production has prospered greatly. Mr. Bickley has merely super-tax worries. He's a good mixer. He knows 63 persons by their Christian names. He is always ready to talk golf shop, with particular reference to a gross 87 he once shot on a short course burnt to a cinder. He makes almost exactly the same slice of the first tee twice on Saturday and twice on Sunday, and can stow away several rounds of drinks without becoming unduly pugnacious, verbose, or pleased with himself. He goes to and fro from the city in a big car and smokes a big cigar during the process, and so on and so on. But he slightly diverges from the type in 2 respects. He quite frequently reads a book that has neither been written by Mr. Edgar Wallace nor recommended to him for its candid treatment of the sex question, and he hasn't got quite the orthodox regular fellow's life partner. Mrs. Bickley is a bit of an enigma to the other RFs. Sometimes they are reassured that she is just what she ought to be, a lovely little woman, again in our American friend's idiom, the adjective being a tribute to her character rather than her physical charms, though these are still considerable. But at other times the RFs have an unpalatable impression that she would like to take them by the shoulders and drown them in deep water. And then they are rather afraid of her and very sorry for Mr. Bickley. As a matter of fact, her mother was an Hungarian and temperamental, one who found even the Budapest variety of RF so desperately, irredeemably deadly that none such ventured for long into her presence. She had been the perfect mistress in her youth, a perfect wife to an Englishman of high intelligence in her middle age, and a formidable and indomitable old woman. In her daughter, these characteristics were strongly diluted by Anglo-Saxon tolerance and phlegm, though sufficient of the fiery spirit remained to save her from becoming just a British female yawn. She was an avid but virtuous flirt in her youth. She is at present a perfect wife for an Englishman of no particular intelligence, and in her old age she will probably be a bit of an autocrat and a nuisance. And there are still to be found traces of that scarifying old mother of hers. Sudden, sharp explosions caused by boredom, quick, short-lived ardours for good-looking men with brains, though she meets very few, and apparently causeless fits of temper, so uncontrollable and uncompromising that poor Mr. Bickley, that nice little man, has always urgently watched the temperamental development of his daughter and only child Mariella for symptoms of that dangerous and irregular Mittel-European strain. And though they are still further diluted, they are there. She's all right in many respects. She is physically flawless and saved from being merely the ordinary full-blooded, smooth-skinned, regular-featured Daily Mirror bathing belle by a delicate upward slant of her eyelids and a certain indefinable but captivating chic by an air of slightly exotic breeding and an absolute incapacity for giggling at little odd, erotic moments. Again, though she is as intellectually incurious as a portable wireless set, she is as sexually inquisitive as a curate, and in Mr. Bickley's opinion she knew what every young girl ought to know much sooner than any young girl ought to know it. At the age of 15 she had driven the chauffeur, a most high-minded young man, almost out of his mind by the warmth of her feelings towards him, and when they were discovered together by Mrs. Bickley, he had spilled indignant protests all over the garage where Mariella had neatly cornered him. After this infatuation faded, she had experienced a succession of hurried, hot passions for a number of hopelessly ineligible youths, so that Mr. Bickley, with a meanness only excused by his desperation, once upbraided her mother for introducing this culpable and devilish strain into the staid and seemly Bickley stock. Whereupon, the old lady being in the ascendant, he got about 5 times as good as he gave, and spent a restless night composing a dignified letter to the Times on the dangers of mixed marriages. And then came that most desired return to Bickleyism, for Mariella accepted the hand, the in every way desirable hand, of young Arthur Randall. 6 weeks before, it hadn't been desirable at all, for then he had been extremely impecunious and merely, or so at least it appeared, a superlative player of games. Mariella had seen him make 84 runs against Larwood, Barrett and Staples when the dust was flying, and beat 3 men in succession to score the winning try against Wales, and as the applause rose and towered, she had made up her mind and prepared herself for a long and fiercely contested battle with her father. And then Arthur's uncle suddenly slipped his anchor, leaving his nephew £80,000. This timely and unexpected event eased the situation completely, and Mariella was soon flourishing a solitaire diamond ring, and the wedding was fixed for the end of October. The beginning of August found them all installed in a well-appointed furnished house at that aristocratic resort, Brinton-on-Sea, which Mr. Bickley had rented for 7 weeks. This confinement within 4 walls gave Mr. Bickley a not too earnestly desired opportunity of scrutinizing the character of his prospective son-in-law, so far as that young gentleman permitted him to do so. Physically, he was beyond criticism. Tall, lithe and dark, he had exceptional vitality and perfect health. He was a joy to look upon, and the fact that he had stood up to the Notts fast bowlers for 2 hours and had picked their short ones off his nose and plunked them up against the square-leg boundary was sufficient evidence of his courage and pugnacity, as was that vicious off-hand which had turned the Welsh full-back turtle and given him a very sore jawbone for a week. It would have been very soothing to have been able to couple these moral qualities and physical attributes with the £80,000 and find nothing more to scrutinize. But Mr. Bickley reluctantly and irritably nosed up something else, something enigmatic, elusive, buried so deep, as it were, that Mr. Bickley felt his nose was only long enough to unearth its fringes and vague outline. What was it? Well, it sometimes revealed itself in sudden and most unexpected flashes of brutal, ruthless insight, almost a devilish sort of flourished egoism, most singular in so usually commonplace a master of moving spheres and ovals. Yet was he ever quite commonplace? Wasn't that orthodox exterior possibly a very cunningly adjusted mask? Unpleasant questions, which Mr. Bickley reprimanded his mind for asking about his prospective son-in-law. Yet they had some justification. For example, on one occasion they had all been sitting on the beach, and he had been reading out from the Daily Express an account of the lamentable defalcations of a former business acquaintance, with appropriate comments, and then young Randall had suddenly stared into his face with the most ironical and piercing expression and said, "There, but for a spot of caution and the grace of old Nick, went Horace Bickley," which was exceedingly rude, and he hoped unjustified. It had taken him very much aback, though both Mariella and her mother had seemed amused. And then again, when they had been discussing a peculiarly unpleasant murder of a young woman by a solicitor's clerk, and marvelling how he could have brought himself to commit such an atrocity, young Randall had remarked with frigid detachment she'd probably bored him, and if by slitting her gullet he prevented her from boring anyone else, I consider he did a service to society. He said something unexpected and in bad taste like that quite often. Did he mean such things? He certainly appeared to. Well, Mariella wasn't quite ordinary either. All those difficult adolescent tendencies, now so pleasantly dormant that her foreign blood explained but didn't eliminate, and other little signs here and there showed she had a slight streak of some kind. Perhaps their prospects of marital happiness would be increased by the fact that each was slightly peculiar. And certainly it was most reassuring that young Randall seemed so utterly devoted to Mariella, fiercely and fanatically so, and she seemed to have concentrated at last in a sort of smouldering and unvarying way. Mr. Bickley had waded his way through the evidence to a fairly favourable summing up when something else came to worry him. Mariella didn't seem very flourishing. The family GP had described her as the most flawless physical specimen he had ever examined, and the sun and air and sea of Brinton should have put the keenest edge on this brilliant Toledo blade. And the close presence of her lover should have made her spirit leap within her. The actual result was depressingly different. After the first few days she seemed limp and lethargic and snappy in the mornings. She shook this off during the day, but began to droop again at sundown and showed a marked distaste for going to bed. Not a distaste born of overmastering vitality, but something less reassuring than that, something less readily explicable. Her mother had noticed it, of course, and was rather worried, had questioned her gently and been testily repulsed. Look at her now, for example, just come in from bathing on such a glorious day, and young Randall gazing at her with such undisguised adoration. What more could she want? Yet she seemed shadowed, brooding over something. She really almost looked ill, and yet, in a purely physical sense, radiantly healthy. It must be some mental trouble. But what conceivable reason could there be for it? Yes, she was looking in that way worse than he'd ever seen her look, worse even than when he'd kicked that ghastly young dancing partner creature down the steps at home. It then occurred to Mr. Bickley that his old friend, Sir Perseus Farrar, had just arrived at the Royal Hotel, and that he was the greatest authority in Europe on that awful and occult business, the female nervous system. How Mr. Bickley admired a man who had the audacity to make a living out of delving into that monstrous region, that scarifying inferno. He knew it was the unforgivable sin to consult members of the medical profession out of office hours, and especially while on holiday. But Sir Perseus was such an old friend, kindly person, and so fond of Mariella that he'd risk it if she didn't get better. So, far from getting better, she burst into hysterical tears in the middle of breakfast that very next morning, ran up to her bedroom, locked her door, and refused to see anyone. So Mr. Bickley trotted round to the Royal. He found Sir Perseus smoking in the lounge, and forthwith burst into a halting recital concerning Mariella, liberally studied with apologies. These Sir Perseus cut short. "My dear Horace," he said, "I was just thinking when you came in how glad I should be to have a little work to do. I'm always like that after a week's idling, and though I'm very sorry that which will rescue me from my sloth is some trouble with my dear and exquisite Mariella, I don't suppose there's much wrong, and if I can set it right, I shall feel doubly grateful to you for allowing me to don my harness for an hour or two. I'll drop in casually after lunch," which he did, and Mariella came out of her seclusion to greet him. By arrangement, Mrs. Bickley and young Randall had gone out before his arrival, and very soon Mr. Bickley found an excuse to absent himself. Sir Perseus was not a famous authority on the female nervous system for nothing, and within a quarter of an hour Mariella was telling him something to which he was listening with an absorbed and authoritative attention. At the end of half an hour he began to ask questions, and at the end of an hour he patted her hand and told her there was nothing seriously to fuss about, but that unless she objected he would like her to put himself in his hands, by which he meant that she should tell him at once anything else which happened and confide absolutely in him. She agreed, thankfully, and then he left her with a very puzzled and thoughtful expression on his face, and, as arranged, met Mr. Bickley on the front. They sat down on the seat overlooking the sea, on which Sir Perseus stared for a time, while Mr. Bickley waited rather anxiously for him to speak. "I don't think it's anything at all serious," said Sir Perseus at length, "but very unpleasant for her, poor child. It's a nightmare she's been having. I asked her if she were accustomed to dream, and she replied with great candour that ever since she could remember she had dreamt frequently and vividly of young men." Mr. Bickley shuffled on his seat, his thoughts winging back. I suppose," he said, "that's quite usual, quite natural. I mean, most young girls dream of young men." "Oh, quite," replied Sir Perseus. "But I gather that her dreams have been exceptionally, vivid." "I was relieved to hear it, for it makes the deep etching of this nightmare less hard to explain. Apparently, she experienced it for the first time 10 days ago, on the second evening she was here. She's had it twice since. It takes this form. As she relates it, her room appears to be divided into 2 parts. That in which she herself is in darkness. The rest of the room is highly lighted. In it there's a bed, rather a big bed, and on it is an old man with a longish grey beard wearing a nightshirt. He is apparently writhing in great agony. He is twisting over and over, his hands to his heart, his head flung back, and then he suddenly rolls over and drops from the bed to the floor and is hidden from her. Then the light seems to spread towards her across the carpet, and she sees between the bed and where she is placed a coffin on the ground. And it seems to her as though there must be many cracks in this coffin, for long grey hair is streaming through it, some coiled over the lid and some streaming upwards. and presently the lid starts slowly to rise, and then the whole room is in darkness, and she has the impression that something is moving towards her, and then bending over her, and she feels something spreading over her face. Hair, she thinks. She has a sensation of suffocation and awakes. "My God!" cried Mr. Bickley, "that's foul, dreadful. Poor little girl. What a bestial, terrifying experience." "Yes," replied Sir Perseus. "It is one of the most disgusting and unnerving dreams of the kind I have ever had described to me. There must be some explanation of it. Recurrent nightmares of this type are invariably the echo, stored in the subconscious, of some sharp experience once upon a time recorded. That sounds obscure, and it is so, but I have known very many such cases. Can you recall anything in Mariella's short existence which, when regurgitated, as it were, might cause this beastly dream? Anything to do with a grey-bearded man, for example?" "Nothing whatever," said Mr. Bickley emphatically. "I've certainly come across grey-bearded men in the course of business and so on, but I cannot remember that Mariella has ever met one." But what a lot of men Mariella has taken to, she thought to himself. It is conceivable there was one with a grey beard, but it's excessively improbable. "I stress the detail of the beard," continued Sir Perseus, "because it seems to be the hair which sharply dominates this dream, and chiefly disturbs Mariella's mind. For example, when she broke down at breakfast, it was because, so she told me, she saw someone with a grey beard pass by the window, which shows how sensitive she is to, and preoccupied by, the hair element. And I am convinced that she must have had some shock, long ago, quite possibly, connected with a person so adorned, and that this vile dream is a throwback to this experience. I have told her to sift her memory for something of the kind. I am interested in her case, not only for professional reasons. I am very fond of her, and I feel it is up to me to exorcise this horror. She is too young and too innocent to be made a victim of such devilry. She has agreed to put herself in my hands and consult me at once if there are any developments. I will send her a sleeping draught, and I suggest she should not sleep alone. She had better have her mother with her in the same room, also a night light, and try to give her as amusing and tiring a day as possible." I certainly will, said Mr. Bickley, and I'm deeply grateful to you for taking up the case, if that isn't too alarming a way of putting it. She shall sleep in our room, and I'll move into hers. But good heavens, if I thought as I got into bed I was doomed to have that dream, I should never dare close my eyes. Remember this, said Sir Perseus. If you actually had such a dream, it would not seem quite as dreadful as you expect it to be. That is an axiom of human experience. It is not quite as shocking to Mariella as you think it must be. Nevertheless, it is loathsome enough, and therefore we've got to be very gentle and very swift-witted with her. Oh, these dreams, how often I've puzzled over them. I'm always firmly maintained that they were distorted echoes of reality, though I know there is a school which regards them as nothing of the sort, but as reflections from another mode of consciousness, so that they can be prophetic. More than that, definitely another existence, as it were, so much so that if the dreaming faculty was fostered to its highest voltage, waking up might be equivalent to slipping into dreamland, and sinking into dreamland really waking up. But that is too hard a saying for my old cranium to digest. But the land of dreams is largely an unexplored terrain, or anyway, unsuccessfully mapped and surveyed, and Mariella's case sharply reminds me of it. And now I must be off, my dear Horace. Don't worry, we will make her once more as sweetly light-hearted and fancy-free as she deserves to be. When Mr. Bickley got back to the house, Mariella had gone to lie down, but her mother and young Randall were awaiting him. He retailed to them a brief resume of what Sir Perseus had told him. Mrs. Bickley had one admirable trait. In moments of crisis she acted first and talked afterwards, though most certainly she talked afterwards. So, with hardly a word, she bustled off to see about the change of rooms and the purchase of night lights. Compared with young Randall's reception of the news, hers seemed almost callous and unfeeling, for he became highly agitated and upset to an extent that slightly surprised Mr. Bickley, for surely it wasn't as bad as all that. Young Randall went very white and cross-examined him closely and urgently concerning the details of Mariella's nightmare, and seemed more and more distressed at every additional detail of it. As if such minutiae made any great difference, wondered Mr. Bickley. How very much in love with her he must be. He felt compelled to impress on him that they must all do as Sir Perseus had decreed, and keep Mariella's spirits up and her mind off her trouble as much as possible, and so on. But young Randall hardly seemed to be listening to these excellent platitudes, and if he hadn't been drinking a good deal when he came down to dinner, Mr. Bickley was no judge of the earlier stages of intoxication. Mariella, on the other hand, seemed better, and the doctor's visit had restored her confidence, and this was justified, for under the influence of the sleeping draught she enjoyed 10 hours of dreamless slumber, and was very glad to have her mother by her side, and a tiny light shining between them. The next morning she was in excellent spirits, and once more keenly appreciative of those glances of masculine admiration and feminine envy which she always evoked, as she slipped her wrap from her shoulders and stepped slowly down the beach to the sea. She was, and still is for that matter, 5 feet 9 inches and a half in height, magnificently marshalled. The peculiar beauty of her figure is due to the fact that while she seems very long from hip to knee, she is 1 inch longer from knee to foot, and her torso, rippling, taut, and beautifully developed, is just exactly proportionately right. When the critical eye of the Brinton visitor turned from her perfection to the many other very good figures on the beach, their slight but recognizable flaws seemed brutally intensified. And then those tantalizingly lifted eyelids. Well, young Randall was deemed a damn lucky dog so soon to have all those rare felicities to sample. Yet on that occasion he didn't look as if he sufficiently appreciated the fact. He looked morose and hardly said a word. A thick night or a tiff, surmised the knowing onlookers. Sir Perseus looked in during the afternoon and professed himself quite satisfied with the patient, and for 48 hours he had every reason to be. But 3 nights later, Mrs. Bickley woke up suddenly and looked across to Mariella. She was lying on her back and moving about with a slight incessant restlessness. Shall I wake her? Thought her mother. No, I'll wait a little while. It may be nothing. Presently Mariella's motions became more rapid, pronounced and urgent, and then she sat up in bed and began thrusting with her hands and then brushing her face as if to free it from something which was spreading over it. This impressed her mother very horribly, and she jumped out of bed and went over to her, spoke her name and touched her gently. And presently she awoke, her eyes staring, her body trembling, and then she burst into tears. Her mother gave her a sleeping draught, stroked her hair and comforted her, and took her to her own bed. Soon her sobbing became less violent, and as the drug allied itself with her exhaustion, she fell into a deep sleep. Mrs. Bickley, however, didn't close her eyes again that night. Early next morning she rang up Sir Perseus, who was vaguely reassuring. Whatever the cause, he said, it cannot be expected that complete recovery can be immediate. For the present he ordered a sleeping draught every night. Mariella seemed listless but faintly cheerful, and after her bathe almost her usual self. Mr. Bickley was worried, but succeeded in disguising the fact. Young Randall was told nothing about it, and then there was another 3 days' pause, and everyone's spirits rose again. Mariella's temperament demanded a certain amount of solitude. She had found a very secluded spot wherein to rest and read in the afternoons, and she liked to go there alone after tea for a while. It was beside a groyne about half a mile from the house. She used to go there in her bathing dress and have a dip just before going back to change for dinner. On the 4th day after her bad night, she strolled down there about 5 o'clock. Randall and her father were playing golf, and Mrs. Bickley was busy with the laundry. Mariella usually returned about 6:30, but on this occasion 7:15 struck, and still she had not appeared. "We'd better go and fetch her," said Mr. Bickley to young Randall. "She may have gone to sleep." He tried to keep all traces of uneasiness out of his voice, but each knew the other was anxious as they walked at top speed towards that little cosy spot under the shelter of the groyne. What they saw when they reached it made young Randall leap recklessly down the 15 feet from the sea wall to the beach, while Mr. Bickley ran for the steps. For Mariella lay sprawled down the shingle. Her beach cloak had draped itself over her head so that only her legs were visible. Her book lay where she had flung it, almost at the water's edge. Young Randall pulled back the cloak. Her face was dead white, and she was unconscious. He dashed down to the sea, soaked his handkerchief and squeezed the water over Mariella's face, but she showed no sign of recovery. "We must carry her back," said Mr. Bickley. By good fortune a taxi was passing just as they got her to the top of the steps, and 3 minutes later she was lying in her bed, and Mr. Bickley was telephoning to Sir Perseus. He was in, and the taxi was sent to fetch him. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bickley and young Randall were busy with restoratives and hot water bottles. Mariella was just conscious but quite dazed when Sir Perseus arrived. After a few hurried words with Mr. Bickley, he went upstairs and asked to be left alone with his patient. Half an hour later, he left her in charge of her mother and came downstairs. He was looking grave as he joined the 2 men in the study. Though he had something else almost monopolizing his mind, the attention of his expert eye was fleetingly seized by the appearance of young Randall, who was looking almost as ill as his young woman, he thought. "Well," he said, "the bare facts are these. Mariella was resting against the breakwater and reading when she felt something tickling her neck, and she paid no heed for a while, and then the irritation became more insistent. She looked round casually, and according to her account, streamers of grey hair were flowing through cracks in the woodwork and coiling round her neck. She remembers nothing more." Young Randall poured himself out half a tumbler of neat whisky and drained it. "What is it? What is it?" cried Mr. Bickley desperately. "It is, to put it crudely, an hallucination," replied Sir Perseus, "and I will not disguise from you the fact that it is a serious matter. A nightmare is one thing. a violent waking illusion of this kind quite another. I must tell you one thing. She says occasionally she has the impression that someone is whispering in her ear. But good God, said Mr. Bickley miserably, that sounds like madness. It sounds like nothing of the sort, replied Sir Percius sharply. Get any such idea out of your head. Mariella is ill, but she's absolutely sane. Of course she's sane, said young Randall violently. Sir Percius looked across at him, and once more his expert eye was steeply challenged by that look about him. What does she hear whispered? Asked Mr. Bickley. She's uncertain about that. She thinks she has heard the words September the 10th, but usually it sounds more like vague chatter. She likened it rather vividly to those soft, husky mutterings one often hears between items on the radio, and once or twice she fancies she hears a sort of sniggering chuckle. She believes she heard such a sound first before she felt that tickling sensation. However, I don't think such details have much significance. The point is, she's ill. She has some disturbing, I may say, dangerous symptoms. She must not be left alone. She must have the reinforcement and comfort of you all, and especially of you, Mr. Randall. You are to be her future husband, and she naturally already regards you as the person who will guard and cherish her in the coming time. All this is inevitably a very horrible business for you, but you must do your utmost to conceal the fact in front of her. Have you ever really known a case like this? Asked young Randall, leaning forward and regarding the specialist with a haggard and earnest gaze. I mean, do people have such hallucinations without any real cause for them? Sir Percius paused before replying. That depends on what you mean by real cause. I have known similar cases, but only when, as I've told Mr. Bickley, some deep indentation has been made on the patient's mind from severe shock, psychic shock, I mean. I've read, of course, of some alleged phenomena reported from eastern lands, which have always seemed to be hopelessly unsubstantiated. Witchery, hocus-pocus, mumbo-jumbo. If such phenomena have any basis in fact, they can, in my opinion, be satisfactorily explained by the potent influence of autosuggestion on the primitive mind. It is significant that they seem to lose their force with the donning of trousers. But we are wandering far from the point. The subject on hand, and I must go and get something to eat. Mariella, he concluded impressively, is a healthy-minded Western girl. She isn't a Zulu or a South Sea Islander, and she is in great trouble. I do not wish to minimize the extent of that trouble, but she can and must be cured, and you too, of course a mother, but you especially, Mr. Randall, can greatly assist the process of recovery by your tact, your love, your intelligent determination. Mr. Bickley saw him out, and while he was doing so, young Randall drank another half-tumbler of neat whisky. Mariella recovered slowly. The next day she had several attacks of semi-hysteria, and she insisted that everything grey should be taken from her room, and she had a strong but diminishing antipathy for hair, so much that she asked her mother to wear a shawl over her head, and the latter cut away the ribboned streamers from the electric fan, because she noticed Mariella staring at them in rather a strange way as they fluttered in the draught. Young Randall spent several hours a day with her, and appeared to be attempting, without complete success, to be obeying Sir Percius's instructions. The latter came every afternoon and was breezily chatty and reassuring, but it was a full week before his patient was well enough to come downstairs, though she had no relapse in the meantime. But Sir Percius was less reassured by this than he allowed himself to appear. She never referred to her condition or trouble, and seemed indeed rather disinterested in her progress, and yet, so it seemed to Sir Percius, she was psychically abnormal, subtly so, almost as though she were entranced, hypnotized, though in a very sly, unobtrusive way. He attributed this vague spiritual eccentricity to shock, and he told himself that she would either make a slow but sure recovery or relapse suddenly and violently and become past his aid. She talked very little, and paid the very slightest heed to anything anyone else said. She spent most of the day sitting in a chair on the beach and staring out to sea. Somehow she doesn't seem quite a free agent, thought Sir Percius. Her mother, who hid a very deep distress with heroic success and had become just the mother of a sick child, had formed the habit of waking up frequently during the night, but only once found anything to report to Sir Perseus, when Mariella suddenly sat up in bed and said, "Who's that whispering?" and then sank back again and went to sleep, though she muttered at intervals, as if discussing something almost under her breath with someone who was visiting her in her dreams. That happened during the early hours of September the 9th. On the next morning there was a remarkable change in her. She came down to breakfast in her bathing costume and seemed her old carefree self. She talked away fluently and flippantly, and one would have judged she kept no remembrance whatsoever of any displeasing experiences. Young Randall, who had been a wretched, withered shadow of himself ever since that evening when he had seen Mariella sprawled down the shingle and drinking far too much, in Mr. Bickley's opinion, responded instantly to his fiancée's changed state, and it was a very thankful and delighted trio which went down with Mariella to the beach about 11 o'clock. It was a blithe day, cloudless and breezy, and the small waves chased in hard on each other's heels. Mariella and young Randall stretched themselves out and let the searching rays of the sun pour through them, and then, just before 12 o'clock, they got up lazily and dawdled down to the water's edge. The beach was crowded, and Mariella seemed quite content that everyone should have a generous opportunity of scrutinizing once more her exquisite workmanship and finish. "I've heard a rumour," said one envious damsel to another, "that she's really not quite all there. Gets fits about once a week." "She certainly has got something rather odd about her," said her girlfriend. "I expect that's why that Mr. Randall has been looking so worried lately. What a figure he's got, and how good-looking. I'd give 10 years of my life for a month with him. What a shame he should be tied up to someone who isn't quite sane." These charitable and erotic observations had just been exchanged when Mariella began to step delicately into the sea. Young Randall was already swimming about and waiting for her to join him in a cruise to the raft. She forced her way slowly in, rubbing her hands and uttering the conventional light cries evoked by the tart embraces of the North Sea. She paused for a moment as it splashed up over her waist, waved her hands to her parents, and then strode forward again. The water had just reached her neck when she suddenly screamed, flung up her hands, and disappeared. In an instant the beach was in an uproar. Those in the sea swam furiously towards the spot where she had last been seen. A dozen sunbathers dashed down into the sea. The boatman struggled at his oars, but young Randall was there first, and he dived for her. To Mr. and Mrs. Bickley, who dashed down to the sea, it seemed 1,000 years till he appeared, holding Mariella round her armpits, and brought her ashore. A doctor had run up, and he got busy with artificial respiration, but Mariella, though she had swallowed more sea water than was good for her, was in no danger of death from drowning, and though she showed no sign of coming to, she was very soon in a condition to be carried back to the house. A quarter of an hour later, Sir Perseus was at her bedside, and then for a moment she recovered consciousness, and after staring fixedly at Sir Perseus for a full 10 seconds, she said in a cold, toneless voice, I put my foot on her face. I could feel it. And then I felt the hair, and it began to come up my legs and pull me down. And then she began to scream and scream and scream, and it took all the strength of Sir Perseus and young Randall to hold her down in bed. Presently her struggles became less violent, and Sir Perseus put a hypodermic syringe into her arm. 5 hours later she was on her way to a London nursing home in an ambulance which paid no heed to speed limits, her mother and Sir Perseus with her. His last words to her father and young Randall were, "I will save her reason if I can, but you must be prepared for the worst." And then, with the light of battle in his eye, he leaped into the ambulance. Mr. Bickley and young Randall stayed behind by his orders. They would only be in the way for the present. He would ring up early the next morning and tell them what to do. Mr. Bickley, who spent the evening in deep and melancholy reverie, hardly noticed the absence of young Randall. He in no way wished for company, and no doubt Randall felt the same way. Could Mariella have had some affair with a greybeard? She might have had. Certain horrible conjectures tapped for entrance to his brain. Utterly worn out, he lay down on the sofa in the drawing-room, but he could not sleep. At 7 o'clock a maid came in and handed him a letter. To his surprise, he recognized young Randall's writing on the envelope. He opened it and found it contained 2 separate enclosures. The first he took up was headed Letter 2, Letter 1 to be read first. So he unfolded number 1 and read as follows. Dear Mr. Bickley, when you get this, I shall be lying in the gorse patch below the 8th tee, and I shall have even less brains in my head than I was born with. Incidentally, it will be the first time I was ever on the left-hand side of that fairway. No doubt that sounds very flippant, but once I had finally made up my mind to shoot myself and knew I should have the guts to do it 4 hours ago, I became almost light-hearted in a way, exalted, scrubbed and robed for death. This mood would not have lasted, but it will remain with me at least long enough. The fact is, I poisoned my uncle, which was not nearly so difficult a feat as it sounds, for his doctor was half-witted, and I made a careful study of his habits and his medicine chest. He was a vile, disgusting old sadist, and I feel no remorse whatsoever. Killing him seemed as natural a performance as beating down a wasp, and by killing him I did many people a service, for everyone who served him and was in his employ breathed a sigh of relief when they heard of his death. However, I am no altruist, and I should never have taken the serious risk entailed by experimenting with his sleeping draught but for one thing. It came to my knowledge that he was about to make a new will and cut me right out of it. Consequently, I should have to give up Mariella. Now, I am not going to dwell on what that knowledge meant for me, but I know you realize how I feel about her. Life without her is unthinkable. Why, then, am I going to kill myself? For this reason. My uncle had a rather long grey beard. That is why. The moment I heard of Mariella's nightmares, I had a dreadful suspicion that my plans had failed. When I heard why she had had that seizure on the beach, I almost believed it was hopeless. What happened this morning convinced me that the rest was up to me. Now I have no belief in a future life. My uncle was one of the few people I have met who deserve to go to the conventional hell, and I have never met anyone bad enough to merit the conventional heaven. Nevertheless, by some agency, Mariella is being attacked, and I have a curious feeling of certainty that those attacks will cease when I am dead. Her sanity, I am convinced, depends on what I am about to do. Now I have worked out what I believe to be a consistent and plausible explanation of this, but I shall not go into it, for I must hurry, and very probably it would sound like lunacy to anyone but me. If, however, I am wrong, and I meet Uncle Walter hereafter and find out something, then he'll really know what hell can be. But I'm afraid that is too optimistic a prospect. Now, I want you to do something for me. I want you to tear up this letter as soon as you've read it and send the other to the coroner or whatever the procedure is. I can't bear to think that people might point at Mariella as someone who almost married a murderer, and I don't want her to know I was one. So she won't, and I am reconciled to the fact. Sorrow for me for long. When she is well again, I shall just seem part of a horrible memory. And as she forgets that, she will forget me, and I'd rather it was so. Goodbye. I was once so happy with you all. A.R. When he had finished reading it, Mr. Bickley tore the letter to small pieces and burnt it in the grate, and then he took up the other and read, Dear Mr. Bickley, I am about to shoot myself in the gorse below the 8th tee because I have discovered a rather horrible secret about myself. There is no need to tell you what this is, and I'd rather no one knew it, but it makes it impossible for me to marry your daughter, and life without her is unthinkable, so I am doing this. A.R. Mr. Bickley put this epistle back into its envelope and went to the telephone. The following April, Mariella returned from a long sea voyage perfectly restored to health. The following August, she became affianced to a certain Mr. Peter Rains, whose past is as bland and innocent as an infant's posterior, but concerning whose future stupendous prophecies are made. He has just left Oxford, where he was president of the Union, and only the fact that he has been adopted as Conservative candidate for a Midland constituency has prevented him from completing a really brilliant and daring novel. As it is, he is about to publish a slim volume of essays entitled Constructive Toryism. Mariella is blissfully happy, and if she dreams at all, it is of this formidable young thinker. Except just once, when she had a very sharp dream vision of someone dark and lithe, beautifully poised, and flicking Larwood's cannonballs from his nose to the rails. She has one idiosyncrasy. She cannot remain in the same room with a grey-bearded male person, but the owners of such are fortunately uncommon, and even in Scotland becoming rarer every day. Mr. and Mrs. Bickley are very well indeed.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret of the dead come back?
If you like this story and the work I create, consider supporting me on Patreon or a paid membership on YouTube. It helps support my work and gives you access to a large library of members-only content and many hours of stories to listen to.
That was Old Man's Beard by H. Russell Wakefield. I like a bit of Wakefield, but I wish I'd picked another voice for Sir Perseus because I've still got a sore throat. So let's talk a little bit about H. Russell Wakefield. So Herbert Russell Wakefield was born in 1888 and he died in 1964. He was a writer of supernatural fiction, remembered for his ghost stories mostly, but he did publish detective stories and true crime stories. He was born in Kent and he was a son of a bishop. A lot of our writers have clergymen as fathers. He was educated at Marlborough College and University College, Oxford, where he read modern history and distinguished himself in sport. You see that with the golf, I think. I bet he was a keen golfer. I don't know that as a fact. Somebody might do. So he served as a captain in the Royal Scots Fusiliers during the First World War, seeing action in France and the Balkans. After the war, he worked in publishing and he actually became chief editor at William Collins, Sons & Co. His literary life and publishing experience fed directly into his fiction, which often features professionals, journalists and academics whose encounters with the supernatural disrupt an otherwise rational world. In terms of where he belongs in the lineage of ghost story writing, he's seen as a descendant of M.R. James, and his work does show some influence of James, albeit he's a newer writer than James. He's a generation or so later, and also Algernon Blackwood. But he diverges from Jamesian antiquarianism by modernising the ghost story, and he uses settings drawn from contemporary life. That is his life, his contemporary life. Modern offices, motoring, radio broadcasts, psychological language. And I think in his time it was quite common for middle class, not high middle class potentially, but sort of bourgeois families to take a place at the seaside for weeks and months on end. And in this case, it's the North Sea, so I'm thinking it's probably Essex or East Anglia, somewhere like that. He talks about in Scotland, which was interesting, you know, at the end. And I think he's not Scottish, but he was with the Scots Fusiliers, so he'll know a lot of Scots. So he's having a bit of a dig there about them still in his days wearing long grey beards. You don't see it much these days. I know lots of Scottish people who live in Carlisle, right on the border. I go to Scotland a lot. Don't see a lot of long grey beards. So his most significant collection include They Return at Evening, 1928, Old Man's Beard, this one's collection, 1929, A Ghostly Company, 1935, The Clock Strikes 12, 1940, and Strayers from Sheol, 1961. You can get a number of these. You can get that last one on the internet. He was, the Ash Tree Press issued, when he was dead, a complete ghost stories, including a volume of previously unpublished material. Ash Tree Press, presumably referring to M.R. James's story, The Ash Tree. I only just thought of that. How come I didn't know that? Anyway, he believed in psychic phenomena in his early life, but his later writings suggest a conflicted stance. He came to see psychic sensitivity as a harmful throwback at what he called a debilitating atavism, and concluded that the dead have nothing of importance to tell us. I think if you've ever kind of done any work, mess around with Ouija boards or any automatic writing, you find they talk mostly nonsense. Some of his best tales have a tone of bitter fatalism. He could be a bit formulaic. He was accused in later in life. He was of the generation that branched into August Derleth and Arkham House. I think he had and he published in some of the pulp magazines as well. So he was a crossover from that Edwardian. You remember that M.R. James was praised by H.P. Lovecraft and was very sneery about Lovecraft. I didn't know who he was, and Lovecraft wrote his essay on supernatural fiction. Lovecraft was actually very kind to a lot of people like this, and M.R. James was a bit snooty, and E.F. Benson. You can't imagine E.F. Benson having much to do with the Lovecraft crowd, and these Edwardian, very kind of superior, I would say. Maybe they thought they were, which is different. They thought they were a bit above. I get that impression, but yet Wakefield is a crossover, isn't he? He's got feet in both camps, in the weird fiction and the English. I say that measuredly. English Edwardian tradition. He died in Kensington, in London, 1964. But he destroyed his personal papers and photographs before his death. So, Old Man's Beard. What works in it? First of all, it's comic, isn't it? The beginning is comic, and there's a whole, and he spends a lot of time talking about Horace Bickley, and he's very satirical about the kind of social pretensions, and of course the foreignness of his wife once removed and his daughter twice removed, and how they ascribe all this kind of emotionality. He ascribes all this emotionality to their foreign blood, which was probably a common belief amongst British people of his time, that foreigners were a bit too emotional. They talked too much, they expressed too much emotion to the phlegmatic bourgeois English, Protestant bourgeois English. So, and it's almost like E.F. Benson's comic novels. And who did I do last week? And he wrote some comic novels as well, and I've forgotten all about that. Let me have a look, because I think it was the previous one. I've got the same book, so I'm just going through it. The Clock, yeah, Harvey. He wrote some Eustace novels, the comic novels of manners of the English middle classes. So he does that. And then it starts to get a bit weirder. And I wondered all about his dwelling on the physical charms of primarily Mariella, but also her boyfriend, Randolph. I've just said his name. I forgot, Randall. So there's all that. And I think we've got to work out whether that actually, in the classic sort of horror film, a nice American couple move into a nice suburb, into a house, and it establishes they're all eating pizza around the TV, all playing ball games, punching each other on the shoulder, playing with the dog, and there's this technique of levity, and then something horrific happens, and he's using that, but the issue about it is, does it actually detract? So that's my first point, really. Does it detract? I think my feeling is it does. I enjoyed it, but that as a separate story, I would have enjoyed it more if he'd done it fully humorous, because then later on the horrific comes in. And I think what works very well for him are these tactile sensations. The idea of the old, there's something quite disgusting of an old man's beard, and he's in a coffin, it's growing. It's that loathsomeness of the dead, and the hair and the nails growing among the dead still, and just that feeling. I can imagine that this young woman would not really enjoy being wrapped around by the growing hair of a dead old man's beard. That is fairly weird, and that's what I mean about him going into weird tales territory, even though it's not so much Lovecraftian weird tales as you do get traces of this in James and M.R. James and E.F. Benson, this oddness, which I think is particularly effective. So, and then of course we've done a couple of stories of his before. We did the Red Lodge, And if you remember, the Red Lodge is a great story about an artist, his wife, and a young son. They rent a country house and they face escalating unease. Same kind of idea about, oh, it's all nice at first, and then, oh no, And if you remember in that one, they see a monk. I won't do any spoilers, but there's this slimy green stuff which isn't explained. And I think, of course, I've said many times that the weirdness is best when it's not explained. And then, of course, we did the Blind Man's Buff, which plays on claustrophobia. Again, no spoilers, but I can't really talk about things without giving you spoilers, can I? So you might say that The Red Lodge is one of his earliest stories, published in 1928, and Old Man's Beard is a year later. Is he going towards a more psychological horror in this one? I mean, this idea of the possessing nightmare. There's also the subtext of guilt. I thought it was an interesting story. So when I said I didn't think that the humour worked particularly, to be really clear what I'm saying, the humour as humour works. I think it's really good. I really enjoyed it, his character sketches. I think the horror works as well. I'm just not sure of the juxtaposition so much. But what I would say is that the twist at the end, that she is haunted because it's usually the person who's committed the crime, i.e. the Randall killed the rich old nasty uncle. He feels no remorse for that, but the uncle comes and haunts. Now, usually it's the person who has done the crime who gets haunted. So it's interesting that it's his girlfriend. And there are a number of things about this story which I think so I think that's really interesting and quite fresh. Other things about the story which I think are interesting are, he dwells on her figure a lot, almost like it's a bit saucy, like one of these seaside postcards that used to be all the rage. I even remember them when I was growing up. They were still there in the 70s, of busty ladies and stuff carrying melons and things like that, and some red-faced chap making a ribald double entendre. They still existed then, and they were all the rage, been for a long time, so they would have been very familiar to Wakefield, going to the seaside. Yeah, so that, and also the psychological stuff, it seemed actually quite Freudian in lots of ways, which I haven't delved into at all. But this young woman who, so we have it's told from the father's point of view. So this is all Electra stuff, and it's told from the father's point of view. He doesn't really intrude much into it, apart from being just kind of a pair of eyes to see through, and he's concerned about his daughter. But he doesn't go in the ambulance with her. The mother is a similar role. In fact, all the supporting characters, apart from Sir Perseus, are a little bit bland. Apart from they're set up at the beginning, and then he forgets about them. Is what I kind of mean. They're all well described, but they are not important really. She's important. But then this old man thing and the old man's, and I'm like, what's going on here? And I haven't massively analysed it in a Freudian way, and I don't propose to do so, but I think it would be worthwhile. Let me have a look at my notes to see if I've forgotten anything else. So, let's go. So, here we have it. We have Wakefield. It's stated that he built dread through psychically invasive hallucination rather than overt traditional ghost trope. So there's no ghost appears particularly in this. It's all psychological, isn't it? It's all, nobody else sees the ghost. The ghost doesn't appear. It doesn't clank. It doesn't go cold. It's just, it has an effect on her. She puts a foot on its face under the sea, and of course the water would be the subconscious. There's something deeply disturbing about her, the things that are happening to her. Yeah, and it begins with the comic part. Then we have his daughter, who's a fine young girl with a typical teenage sort of crush on this man and that man. Particularly, I would imagine, for his class, that she would have fallen in love with the handsome chauffeur. And there we are. So then Sir Perseus comes in. I thought he was going to be a comic character, but he's not. He's sort of like what is he, a doctor, psychiatrist? And then we have the central nightmare when it starts to get really unpleasant. The hair, the old man's beard, not even his hair, but his beard, which is in some way worse. It would have been worse if it'd been his chest hair, to be fair. And it rises up and envelops her and suffocates her, and there's this suffocating as it creeps out. Almost, it's alive, isn't it? It's like a fungus, which made me think of that green stuff from the Red Lodge. And she has no psychic connection with... She didn't murder him. She didn't even know that her fiancé murdered them. So there's a guilt thing, but it's like... It's his guilt, but actually, he's dissociated from his guilt, isn't he? He doesn't feel any guilt at all, but it's got to go somewhere. I've said many times, there's a darkness, it's got to go somewhere. So in this case, it goes to her, the innocent, really. I feel that it would probably repay a thesis on Wakefield's work. There maybe even is one on Wakefield's work and his use of particularly this tactile stuff to create, or the weirdness of the tactile stuff, because it is pretty weird. Both the green stuff and if the blind man's buff, he's in a house and he can't see anything. It's all dark and it's a house he's going to buy, and it's this psychological but mixed with tactile. See what I'm saying? Yeah. So I haven't got very far with my thesis on Wakefield's work, but I think it's promising. Maybe somebody's done one. If you've done one, let me see it. Anyway, that's probably... I'm running out of time. I've got to take the dogs out and everything. And I'm behind. We're away on Thursday. We're heading down to Somerset via Great Malvern. So I'm looking forward to staying Great Malvern. And we're going down to Somerset. And then as we're coming up, you'd be very jealous about this. I'm staying in Ludlow, which I haven't been to for years. But I used to live in Montgomeryshire. So we used to go over the border to Shropshire. Great place. And to visit. And then on the way back, we're stopping at Pendle, where the witches are from. I always said to Sheila we would stop under the shadow of Pendle Hill, which is where we're staying, and see if she picks up any witchy vibes, because she's psychically sensitive in a way that I simply am not. So I'll just sleep through, but she might have something interesting to tell me the day after. So that's what we're doing. We're going away on Thursday. We're going to be away for a bit, but don't worry, I've got stories recorded and in the pile, and I'm hoping that my daughter Imogen will be commenting and keeping the chat alive if I'm not able to be in touch with you. So yeah, I feel that was a bitty analysis of the story. I feel I touched on the main issues, but just a little bit, and I feel that it had a lot more meat in it that we could have gone into. But I'm all flustered because I'm running out of time, and I've got to take dogs for a walk, and I've got to, you know what it's like. Anyway, you keep well, and I'll be in touch. Well, you'll hear my voice even if I'm not here, which is sort of spooky, isn't it?
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret of the dead come back?